Day 1. The keys felt heavier than they should have in my palm. 3 small pieces of brass and iron that represented everything left of grandfather's life, his cabin, his 20 acres of wilderness, and whatever secrets he'd buried in the remote corners of the Cascade Range. I hadn't been to Cedar Point since I was 12. Now, at 34, the drive up the winding forest road felt like traveling backward through time. Each mile stripped away another layer of civilization until only Douglas firs and silence remained. The cabin appeared through a break in the trees exactly as I remembered it. Weathered cedar walls, a stone chimney, windows that reflected the forest like dark eyes. But something felt different. Smaller, perhaps? Or maybe I was simply seeing it through adult eyes, no longer filtered through the wonder of childhood summers. I pulled my Jeep into the clearing and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through pine needles. The front door key turned smoothly, as if grandfather had oiled the lock recently. Inside, dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows. The familiar scent of cedar and old books filled my nostrils, but underneath lay something else, something medicinal and sharp that I couldn't identify. I set my duffel bag on the kitchen table and walked through the rooms, noting what had changed. The living room looked identical to my memories. Stone fireplace, leather armchair worn smooth by decades of use, shelves lined with field guides and hunting magazines. But the bedroom felt different. Sparse, clinical almost. The bed was made with hospital corners. A small nightstand held only a brass lamp and a leather-bound journal I didn't remember. On the dresser, bottles of pills were arranged in precise rows, medications with names I couldn't pronounce. I picked up the journal, running my fingers over the worn leather cover. Grandfather's initials were embossed in fading gold. R.M.H. Robert Michael Hartwell. Inside, pages of his careful handwriting documented something I couldn't immediately understand. July 15th, 2023. Readings remained stable. No fluctuations detected in the past 72 hours. Beginning to think the medication is finally working. July 18th, 2023. False alarm. The dreams are returning. Dr. Peterson warned this might happen if I reduce the dosage. But I need to remain alert, need to be ready. July 22nd, 2023. Sarah called again. She wants to visit with Michael. I told her the road was washed out. I can't risk exposure. Not now, not when I'm so close to understanding. Sarah was my mother. Michael was me. I flipped through more pages, finding entries that stretched back months, then years. The handwriting grew shakier as I went backward in time, the entries more fragmented and urgent. The containment protocols must be maintained. The vault must remain sealed, whatever the cost. Vault? I'd explored every inch of this cabin as a child. There was no vault. Day 2. I woke at 3:17. IEM to the sound of scratching. Not the familiar rustle of mice in the walls or branches against the roof, but something deliberate, rhythmic, coming from beneath the cabin. I lay in grandfather's bed, listening to the sound fade and return, like claws on wood, or fingernails on stone. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was my imagination. The isolation was getting to me. City dwellers suddenly thrust into absolute wilderness. But when I walked around the cabin's exterior, I noticed something I'd missed the day before. The foundation stones along the eastern wall showed signs of recent disturbance. Mortar had been chipped away and replaced, the new pointing obvious against the weathered original. Someone had been digging here, recently. Inside, I examined the floorboards in the same area. The planks looked identical to the rest, but when I knelt and pressed my ear to the wood, I could hear a faint echo beneath. Empty space, where there should be solid earth. The scratching returned that afternoon while I was reading grandfather's journal. 3 sharp scrapes, then silence. 3 more scrapes, then nothing for hours. Found a crowbar in the tool shed and spent the evening testing floorboards, looking for one that might lift. Most were nailed solid, but near the stone fireplace, a section of floor felt different, hollow. The scratching came again at sunset. This time, it seemed to respond to my movement. When I walked to the kitchen, it followed. When I stopped, it stopped. Something was under there, something that knew I was here. Day 3. The discovery. The loose floorboards came up easier than expected, revealing a framework of support beams and, beneath them, a concrete shaft leading down into darkness. Modern construction, completely at odds with the cabin's rustic appearance. The shaft was maybe 4 feet square, with metal rungs bolted to one wall forming a crude ladder. At the bottom, perhaps 8 feet down, I could see the edge of what looked like a heavy door. I lowered a flashlight on a rope first, illuminating a small chamber hewn from bedrock. The door was steel, painted institutional green, with no visible handle or lock, just a smooth surface marked by a series of symbols etched into the metal. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the flashlight beam. The scratching had stopped the moment I opened the floor. Now the silence felt expectant. Waiting. I climbed down the ladder, my boots echoing against stone. The chamber was cold, maybe 50 degrees, and the air carried that same medicinal smell I'd noticed in the bedroom, but stronger here, chemical, antiseptic. The door was seamless except for the symbols. No hinges visible from this side, no keyhole, no handle. But when I pressed my palm against the steel, it was warm. Body temperature. As if something alive waited on the other side. I spent hours examining those symbols, sketching them in my notebook. They weren't random scratches, but carefully designed patterns. Circles within triangles, intersecting lines that formed complex geometries, spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward until looking at them too long made my head ache. That night, I dreamed of the symbols. They danced behind my eyelids, rearranging themselves into new configurations. And in the dream, I understood what they meant. The knowledge felt ancient, inherited, as if it had always been waiting in some locked corner of my mind. The seal must hold, the threshold must not be crossed, what sleeps below must never wake. I jerked awake with those words echoing in my skull, though I couldn't remember hearing them spoken. Day 4. Grandfather's journal became my obsession. I read it cover to cover, then started again, looking for patterns and clues. August 3rd, 2019. The dreams are getting worse. Dr. Peterson increased the dosage, but the medication only dulls the edges. I can still hear it calling, still feel its presence beneath the foundation. August 15th, 2019. Found Dad's notes in the attic. The thing has been here longer than I thought. Much longer. The responsibility passes down through bloodlines, from father to son. Soon it will be my grandson's burden. My burden. September 2nd, 2019. Tried to seal the entrance permanently. Poured concrete over the floor access. It broke through in 3 days. The containment field is weakening, or it's getting stronger. September 28th, 2019. The symbols are changing, rearranging themselves, as if it's learning, adapting. After all these years, it's still growing. I found the reference notes in a wooden box tucked behind dusty Christmas decorations in the attic. My great-grandfather's handwriting, even shakier than grandfather's had become. 1978. Built the containment chamber, according to the specifications found in father's papers. The entity remains dormant, but its influence spreads. Already I can feel it in my dreams, showing me things that haven't happened yet, things that might happen if the seal fails. 1979. Michael is asking questions about the construction noise. Had to tell him I was installing a root cellar. The boy is clever, too clever. I fear what he'll inherit when I'm gone. 1983. The government men came again. Asked about unusual seismic readings in the area. Told him it was just settling in the old mine shafts. They seemed to believe it. For now. Government men? I kept digging through the papers, finding documents that stretched back decades. Letters from agencies I'd never heard of, requisition forms for medical equipment, shipping manifests for materials with classification codes. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in oiled canvas, I found a leather journal, even older than the others. The cover was unmarked, the pages brittle with age. My great-great-grandfather's record. 1923, found a thing in the abandoned copper mine 3 miles northwest of here. Not sure what it is, not sure it matters. What matters is keeping it contained. The local Yakima told stories about this place, called it a wound in the world, said their ancestors sealed something here long ago. 1924, built the cabin over the original containment site. The symbols I found carved into the mine walls seemed to weaken its influence, copied them onto the vault door. Pray they hold. 1925, Sarah is pregnant. The child will inherit this burden when I'm gone. Have begun preparing instructions. The knowledge must pass down. The responsibility must continue. The scratching returned as I read, more insistent than before. 3 scrapes. Pause. 7 scrapes. Pause. 11 scrapes. A pattern. A code. I grabbed my notebook and started transcribing the sequences. After an hour of listening and recording, the pattern became clear. The scratching corresponded to the symbols on the vault door. It was trying to tell me something. Or teach me something. Day 5, the scratching guided me through the night, tapping out sequences that matched the door symbols. By dawn, I understood. The symbols weren't just decorative. They were a lock, a combination that had to be pressed in the correct order. I climbed down into the chamber with renewed purpose. The door seemed different now, less solid somehow, as if my understanding had weakened whatever force held it sealed. The first symbol was a circle bisected by a diagonal line. When I pressed it, the metal gave slightly under my fingers. A soft click echoed from within the door mechanism. So the second symbol, overlapping triangles forming a 6-pointed star. Another click. Third, a spiral that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. The steel grew warmer under my touch. With each symbol I pressed, the door's surface changed. What had appeared solid now showed hair-thin seams around its edges. The medicinal smell grew stronger, joined by something organic, earthy, like fresh-turned soil or decomposing leaves. The final symbol was the most complex, interlocking geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. When I pressed it, the door shuddered. A deep vibration ran through the bedrock, through my bones, through the very air. Then silence. The door swung inward on soundless hinges, revealing a corridor that stretched beyond my flashlight's reach. The walls were carved from living rock, but the surface was too smooth, too uniform. Not natural erosion, but deliberate construction. Cold air flowed from the depths, carrying scents that made my stomach clench. Copper and ozone, sweet decay. And underneath it all, something that wasn't quite a smell. A sensation that bypassed my nose and went straight to the primitive parts of my brain, triggering responses I didn't understand. Fear, reverence, recognition. I almost closed the door then, almost climbed the ladder and sealed the floor again. But the corridor called to me with a voice I felt rather than heard, and I found myself stepping across the threshold. Day 6. The corridor sloped downward for perhaps 50 yards, before opening into a vast chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't find the far walls, and when I dropped a stone, it clattered for several seconds before the sound faded to nothing. But I wasn't alone in the darkness. Something breathed in the depths, not the rapid panting of a small animal, but deep, measured respirations, as if a giant slept fitfully in the chamber's heart. I followed the carved walls, keeping my left hand on stone while my right held the flashlight steady. The breathing grew louder as I descended, joined by other sounds. Wet, organic noises that might have been a heartbeat if the heart were the size of a house. The walls changed as I went deeper. What had been smooth stone became something else, a surface that yielded slightly under pressure, warm to the touch, covered in a network of raised lines that pulsed with their own rhythm. Veins. The walls had veins. My light caught a reflection ahead. Water, I thought at first, but as I approached, I realized it was glass, a massive observation window built into the chamber wall. Thick reinforced panels that reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors. Beyond the glass, something moved. I pressed my face to the window, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the reflection. The space beyond was filled with a pale, phosphorescent mist that shifted and swirled as if stirred by invisible currents. And in that mist, shapes moved. Not one creature, but dozens, hundreds. Pale forms that drifted through the luminous fog like deep-sea jellyfish, translucent bodies pulsing with internal light. But these weren't jellyfish. They had faces, human faces, though elongated and distorted, features stretched until they were almost unrecognizable. I knew those faces. They were mine. Variations of my own features reflected in the mist. Myself as a child, as an old man, as something between human and other. All the possible versions of Michael Hartwell, floating in that impossible space like specimens in a jar. One of the faces turned toward the window. Its mouth opened in a soundless scream, and I saw that its throat was full of stars. I stumbled backward, my light swinging wildly across the chamber walls. In its beam, I caught glimpses of other windows, other observation points, looking into spaces that shouldn't exist. One showed a forest where the trees grew downward from a ceiling of earth. Another revealed a city of glass spires rising from an ocean of blood. And in each window, watching me with hollow eyes, were more versions of myself. Day 7. The central chamber lay at the end of a spiral path that seemed to descend far deeper than the mountain should allow. Here the walls pulsed with visible rhythms, and the air itself seemed alive, thick and warm and humid, like the inside of a lung. At the chamber's heart sat something I couldn't immediately comprehend. My first impression was of a massive organic machine, all curved surfaces and flowing lines, but as I approached, details resolved that made my mind recoil. It was a tree, or had been once. Now it was something else, a fusion of plant and animal and mineral that hurt to perceive directly. Its trunk was translucent, revealing a circulatory system that pumped luminous fluid through branching vessels. The bark moved like skin, rippling with what might have been breathing. But it was the branches that made me understand why my family had spent generations keeping this place sealed. Each branch terminated not in leaves, but in chrysalises, hundreds of them, hanging like fruit from the impossible tree. And in each translucent casing, I could see a figure forming, growing, waiting. All of them were me. Variations or distortions like the faces in the mist, but perfect copies. My face, my body, my scars and birthmarks replicated down to the smallest detail. Some of the chrysalises were nearly mature, their occupants moving restlessly in their confinement. Others held smaller forms, children who wore my features, elderly versions with my eyes. At the tree's base, a plaque had been mounted on a simple metal stand. The words were engraved in multiple languages, but I could read the English. Temporal Problogy Metriac. Subject Michael Robert Hartwell. Harvest cycled 247 iterations. Sedamaxis active cultivation. Warning, containment breach will result in dimensional chaos. Below the plaque, more of my great-great-grandfather's handwriting on a weathered piece of paper. It showed us what it could do. Every possible version of ourselves, growing like fruit on its branches. The government men said it was studying us, learning us, preparing for something they called convergence. We couldn't destroy it, they tried, but we could contain it, hide it, keep it from fulfilling whatever purpose it was designed for. The responsibility passes to each new generation. Someone must watch, someone must guard, someone must ensure it never breaks free. As I read, the tree's pulsing intensified. The fluid in its veins glowed brighter, and the chrysalises began to stir. Whatever process had been interrupted by decades of containment was resuming now that the vault was open. One of the chrysalises near eye level was nearly transparent. Inside, an adult version of myself opened familiar eyes and looked directly at me. Its mouth moved, forming words I could hear despite the barrier between us. Finally, we've been waiting so long. Day 8, I ran, up through the spiraling passages, through the observation chamber with its impossible windows, along the carved corridor to the vault door. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. But as I reached the ladder leading up to the cabin, I stopped. The door was still open behind me, spilling that phosphorescent mist into the corridor. And in that mist I could see shapes moving, following. They weren't fully formed yet, still translucent, still incomplete, but they were emerging from their chrysalises, drawn by my presence, or my fear, or simply by the fact that their long imprisonment was finally ending. I climbed the ladder and slammed the floor panels back into place, then dragged grandfather's heavy armchair over the spot, as if furniture could contain what I'd awakened. But the scratching resumed immediately, rhythmic and insistent, coming from multiple points beneath the cabin now. They were learning the layout, exploring their expanded prison. I grabbed grandfather's journal and my cell phone, then ran outside. No signal. I was too deep in the mountains, too far from civilization. But my Jeep was still there, keys in the ignition, offering escape from this nightmare. I made it halfway to the driver's door before I stopped. Escape to what? To where? If what I'd read in those journals was true, if that thing in the vault really was what the documents claimed, then running would only delay the inevitable. The responsibility passes down through bloodlines. The knowledge must continue. And there was something else, something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge in the horror of discovery. When I'd looked into the eyes of my imprisoned double, I'd felt recognition, not just of features, but of thoughts, memories, as if it really was me, pulled from some other timeline or probability. What if my family hadn't been guarding the world from this entity? What if they'd been protecting it? What if those government men who'd shown such interest in the site weren't trying to contain it but to exploit it? I walked back to the cabin, my feet moving without conscious direction. Inside, the scratching had stopped. The silence felt expectant, waiting. I moved the chair and lifted the floor panels. The mist had thickened, almost solid now, rolling up from the depths like fog from a warm lake on a cold morning. But instead of cold, it brought warmth. The medicinal smell had changed too, becoming something more organic, more familiar, like the scent of my own skin. "Michael!" The voice rose from the depths, soft and patient. My own voice, speaking my own name. "You don't have to be afraid. We're not trying to escape. We're trying to come home." I grabbed grandfather's journal and descended into the mist. Day 9. The entity, I couldn't think of it as a tree anymore, had changed during my absence. The chrysalises were opening, their occupants emerging to stand in the phosphorescent fog like spirits made flesh. All of them wore my face, but I could see differences now, subtle variations that spoke of different choices, different paths, different worlds. The one who had spoken to me stood closest to the observation window. When I approached, he smiled with my mouth but with an expression I'd never worn. "You're wondering if we're real," he said. "If this is real." The answer is yes and no. We're echoes of possibilities, shadows cast by choices not made. The entity you call the tree, it's a collector, a gardener. It cultivates potential. "Why?" I asked, though the word came out as barely a whisper. "Because potential is the most precious thing in any universe. Your grandfather understood this eventually. That's why he sealed us away. not to protect the world from us, but to protect us from the world. Another version of myself approached from the mist. This one was older, his hair gray at the temples, his face marked by lines I hadn't earned yet. "The government found others like this," he said. "Probability farms, they called them, harvesting alternate cells for research, for experiments, for war. They would have used us as weapons, deployed versions of ourselves into other timelines, other realities, to eliminate threats before they could develop." "Your family chose differently," said a third Michael, this one younger, still bearing the soft features of adolescence. "They chose preservation, conservation. They kept us safe from those who would exploit what we represent." I looked around the chamber, at the dozens of versions of myself emerging from their crystalline wombs, each one unique despite our shared origin. Each one representing a path not taken, a choice not made. "What do you want from me?" I asked. The first Michael stepped closer. In the phosphorescent light, I could see that his skin was slightly translucent, veins visible beneath the surface, carrying that same luminous fluid I'd seen in the tree's circulatory system. "We want to live," he said simply. "Not as prisoners, not as specimens, but as ourselves. The tree, the entity, it's dying. Has been dying for decades. Without proper care, without understanding, it's losing the ability to maintain our forms. Soon we'll fade back into mere possibility, lost forever. Unless someone with the proper knowledge takes over its care, learns to tend it, helps it thrive instead of merely survive." The older Michael nodded. "Your grandfather tried, near the end, but he was too frightened, too convinced we were a threat. He kept us sedated, contained, half alive. It's not sustainable." I thought of the medications in grandfather's bedroom, the clinical arrangements, the journal entries about readings and dosages. "The pills," I said. "He was medicating the tree, depressing it, weakening it. The entity isn't malevolent, Michael. It's a refugee, a survivor from somewhere else, sometime else. It creates us not out of malice, but out of loneliness. It's trying to understand human consciousness by growing human forms. And it chose our family because..." The youngest Michael smiled, and for the first time I saw joy in the expression. "Because we chose it first. Your great-great-great-grandfather didn't find it by accident in that copper mine. He was looking for it, following stories, legends, hints of something impossible hidden in the mountains. He was seeking wonder, and he found it. The responsibility doesn't have to be a burden," the older version added. "It could be a gift, an opportunity to nurture something genuinely unique, to be part of something larger than any single timeline." Day 10. I spent hours in the chamber, learning. The entity wasn't malicious. It was curious, desperate to understand the nature of consciousness, of choice, of the countless branching paths that define human existence. It had been creating iterations of my family line for generations, studying each variation, trying to comprehend what it meant to be human. But the versions of myself it created weren't just copies. They were fully conscious, fully independent beings with their own thoughts and desires and fears. They were alive in every way that mattered, and they deserved better than imprisonment. The tree itself was magnificent once I understood what I was seeing, not a parasite or predator, but a gardener of possibility. Its roots extended deep into the mountain, tapping into some source of energy I couldn't identify. Its branches held not just my iterations, but thousands of others. Fragments of consciousness from every person who had ever encountered it. Most of those other forms were dormant, their host bloodlines long since ended, but a few still stirred in their chrysalises, waiting for someone to tend the tree with proper care. "Your grandfather wasn't wrong to be cautious," one of my selves explained as we walked among the massive roots. The government agencies that investigated this site in the early decades, they would have weaponized what they found here, used it to create armies of expendable soldiers, each one identical, each one easily replaced. But that's not what the entity wants, another added. It wants connection, understanding. It wants to grow and learn and experience existence through as many perspectives as possible. I thought of my own life back in the city. My job as a data analyst, my empty apartment, my non-existent social life. I'd been drifting through existence without purpose, without connection to anything larger than myself. Here, surrounded by versions of who I might have been, I felt more alive than I had in years. What would it mean? I asked. To be the caretaker, the gardener. The eldest Michael gestured toward the observation windows. You'd learn to tend the tree properly, feed it knowledge instead of sedatives, help it grow healthy iterations instead of imprisoned ones, guide it toward understanding rather than mere replication. You'd have company, said another. Conversation with minds that think like yours but have experienced different possibilities. You'd never be alone again. And the world above? But never know we exist if that's what you choose. Or you could gradually reveal us, introduce the world to the idea that consciousness isn't limited to single timelines. That possibility itself can be cultivated and preserved. It wasn't really a choice. I'd known from the moment I descended into the mist that I wouldn't be returning to my old life. The tree had been calling to me through generations of my bloodline, and I'd finally answered. I walked to the entity's base and placed my palm against its translucent bark. The moment I made contact, I felt its consciousness touch mine, vast and ancient and utterly alien, yet somehow familiar. It had been studying my family for so long that it knew us better than we knew ourselves. Welcome, it said without words. Welcome home. Day 15. The transformation took 5 days. I felt it beginning the moment I committed to staying. A tingling in my extremities, a slight translucency in my skin, a growing awareness of the tree's vast root network spreading through the mountain. I was becoming part of the entity while remaining myself, a hybrid consciousness, human and other, capable of tending the probability garden with understanding it had never known before. My other selves helped me through the process. They'd been waiting decades for someone to join them in full awareness, and their relief was palpable. No longer prisoners, they could finally explore the extent of their existence. The tree responded to my care like a neglected plant given proper attention. New growth appeared overnight, fresh branches reaching toward the chamber ceiling, new chrysalises beginning their slow development. But these weren't random iterations. They were carefully selected possibilities, chosen for their potential to contribute to our growing understanding of consciousness. I learned to read the tree's needs, to adjust the chamber's conditions, to guide the development of new forms. Some were variations of myself, but others carried genetic patterns from visitors to the site over the decades, people who had briefly encountered the entity's influence and left traces of their consciousness behind. A version of my mother began developing in one chrysalis. Another held someone who might have been Dr. Peterson, grandfather's physician. The tree had been collecting fragments of awareness from everyone who came near it, storing them like seeds until someone could properly tend its garden. We're not replacing the originals, one of my selves explained as we watched the new forms taking shape. We're preserving aspects of them that would otherwise be lost. The thoughts they never voiced, the paths they never took, the potential they never realized. It was beautiful work, meaningful work. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was contributing to something important. Day 23. The first sign that something had changed in the world above came through the tree's root network. It could sense vibrations through the mountain, and recently those vibrations had become more regular, more purposeful. Vehicles on the access road, heavy ones from the sound of it. I climbed the ladder to the cabin for the first time in over a week, leaving the floor panels open so I could hear my other selves if they called. The world above felt thin and insubstantial after the rich atmosphere of the chamber below. Through the cabin windows, I could see lights moving through the forest. Flashlights, spotlights, the distinctive blue-white glow of LED arrays. A lot of them, approaching from multiple directions. My cell phone, which I'd left charging on the kitchen counter, showed 17 missed calls from my mother and 43 from numbers I didn't recognize. The voicemails were a mixture of concern and confusion. "Michael, it's Mom. You were supposed to check in 3 days ago. I'm worried. Call me back." "This is Agent Martinez with the Department of Unusual Phenomena. We need to speak with you regarding your grandfather's property. Please return this call immediately." "Michael, this is your mother again. The police say your Jeep is still at the cabin, but there's no sign of you. Where are you? Please call me." Department of Unusual Phenomena? I'd never heard of such an agency, but the name sent a chill through me. Were these the government men my great-grandfather's journals had mentioned? The lights were getting closer. I could hear voices now, professional and clipped, coordinating some kind of search operation. They'd be at the cabin within minutes. I looked at the open floor panels, at the mist still rising from the depths, and made a decision that felt inevitable. I climbed down the ladder and sealed the entrance from below. Day 24. They found the vault within hours. I could hear them moving through the cabin above, their footsteps echoing down through the mountain stone. Heavy boots, multiple pairs, spreading out to cover every room. "Heat signatures are inconsistent," a voice called, muffled by distance and rock. "Getting readings from below ground level. Check for hidden access panels." The grandfather's journal mentioned a containment facility. They had grandfather's journal, which meant they'd been monitoring the property, waiting for someone to inherit it. Waiting for me. "Got it," another voice called. "Floor panels have been disturbed recently. There's a shaft going down maybe 10 feet. I heard the scrape of moving furniture, the creak of lifting floorboards. A beam of light appeared at the top of the shaft, followed by voices that carried clearly in the stone chamber. Jesus Christ, what is this place? Looks like a laboratory or a prison. Where's the air? Michael Hartwell. Heat sensors showed him entering the building yesterday. Maybe he's down there. Hello, Mr. Hartwell? This is Agent Martinez with the federal government. We need to speak with you. I didn't answer. Around me in the chamber, my other selves had gathered, their translucent forms barely visible in the phosphorescent mist. They looked concerned, but not frightened. "They can't come down," one of them explained quietly. "The mist is toxic to unaltered humans. They'll need protective equipment." "How long do we have?" "Holders, maybe. Depends how prepared they are." I looked toward the vault door, which had sealed itself the moment I'd closed the floor panels above. The symbols had rearranged themselves into new patterns, configurations I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The tree was protecting itself, activating defenses that had lain dormant for generations. "What do they want?" I asked. The eldest Michael materialized from the mist, his features more solid than I'd seen them before. "The same thing the government has always wanted from places like this: control, weaponization. They'll harvest us, study us, find ways to replicate the process for military applications. Your grandfather's generation made a deal with them," another added. "Containment in exchange for secrecy. But that deal dies with each generation. Has to be renegotiated. And if I refuse to negotiate, then they'll take what they want by force." Above us, I could hear the sound of equipment being lowered into the shaft. Gas masks, maybe. Protective suits. They were preparing for contaminated atmosphere. The tree pulsed brighter, its circulation speeding up as stress hormones flooded its system. The chrysalises responded to its distress, their occupants stirring restlessly. Some of the more mature forms began to emerge prematurely, their development incomplete, but their need for protection overriding biological programming. "We can't let them have the others," I said, looking at the hundreds of sleeping forms hanging from the impossible branches. "The people who haven't chosen this, who don't understand what they'd be signing up for." "Then we need to move," the eldest Michael said. "Deeper into the mountain. The tree's root system extends for miles underground. There are other chambers, other growing spaces that the surface world has never found. Leave all this behind. Temporarily, until they give up and go away. or until we can find a way to negotiate from a position of strength. It was a reasonable plan, but as I looked around the chamber that had become my home, at the carefully tended garden of possibility I'd been learning to cultivate, I felt a deep reluctance to abandon it. "There might be another way," I said. Day 25, I climbed the ladder and opened the floor panels. Agent Martinez was a thin woman in her 40s, wearing a hazmat suit and carrying equipment I didn't recognize. She was alone in the shaft, having apparently drawn the short straw for first contact. When she saw me emerge from below, her eyes widened behind her face mask. "Mr. Hartwell, we've been looking for you." "I know," I said. "I've been here the whole time." She looked me over carefully, and I wondered what she was seeing. Did my slight translucency show through normal clothing? Could she detect the changes the tree had made to my biology? "You look different than your driver's license photo," she said carefully. "Healthier. Younger, maybe." "Mountain air," I replied. "Agent Martinez, isn't it? Your voicemails mentioned the Department of Unusual Phenomena. I've never heard of that agency." "Most people haven't. We deal with anomalous situations, like whatever you've discovered in your grandfather's basement." I gestured toward the open shaft. "You're welcome to look around, but I should warn you, the atmosphere down there isn't safe for extended exposure without proper protection." She nodded toward her hazmat suit. "We came prepared. Mr. Hartwell, we know about the facility. We've been monitoring this site for decades. Your grandfather was cooperative, but his records suggest he may not have fully understood what he was dealing with. And you do? We understand it better than most. The entity you've encountered, we've found 17 similar sites across North America. Most were destroyed decades ago. A few, like this one, were contained through agreements with local families. 17 sites. I felt the tree's consciousness stir at this information, a ripple of grief passing through its vast awareness. It had known others of its kind, had felt them die one by one as humanity decided they were too dangerous to preserve. "What happened to the other sites?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Elimination protocols were enacted. When containment failed or cooperation ended, the entities were classified as existential threats to baseline human consciousness." Baseline human consciousness? Agent Martinez climbed out of the shaft, moving with practiced efficiency. Around us, other agents in similar suits were entering the cabin, setting up equipment I didn't recognize. "The entities don't just create physical copies, Mr. Hartwell. They alter the consciousness of anyone who spends extended time in their proximity. Create a kind of hive mind effect. Make people more susceptible to their influence." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "And you think that's what's happened to me? Hasn't it?" She looked at me with eyes that seemed far too knowing. "When did you last feel truly alone? When did you last have a thought that felt entirely your own?" The question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Since descending into the chamber, I'd been aware of my other selves at all times. Their thoughts had become my thoughts, their memories bleeding into my own, until I sometimes couldn't remember which experiences belonged to which version of myself. But that didn't feel like loss of identity. It felt like expansion, like finally becoming complete. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "The same thing we wanted from your grandfather. Cooperation. Help us understand the entity's capabilities. Assist with research that could benefit humanity as a whole." "Research," I repeated. "You mean weaponization?" Agent Martinez didn't deny it. "The potential applications are significant. Imagine being able to deploy multiple versions of a single specialist into different operational theaters. Imagine having access to probability matrices that could predict enemy actions across multiple timelines. Imagine turning conscious beings into disposable tools. They're not truly conscious, Mr. Hartwell. They're sophisticated constructs, echoes of consciousness, not consciousness itself." I felt anger rise in my chest. Not just my own anger, but the collective outrage of every version of myself that had heard those words. Agent Martinez took a step back as something in my expression changed. "You're wrong," I said quietly. "They are as conscious as I am, as you are. They have thoughts, feelings, hopes, fears. They're not constructs or echoes. They're people. People who shouldn't exist. People whose existence threatens the stability of reality itself." Behind her, the other agents had finished setting up their equipment. I could see monitors displaying readouts I didn't understand. Sensor arrays pointed toward the open shaft. Communication devices crackling with encrypted chatter. "You're not here to negotiate," I realized. "You're here to contain or eliminate. We're here to prevent a containment breach. The entity's activity has increased dramatically since you arrived. Seismic sensors show patterns consistent with rapid biological expansion. If left unchecked, it could destabilize the entire regional probability matrix." I had no idea what a probability matrix was, but the threat in her words was clear enough. "And if I refuse to cooperate?" Agent Martinez looked genuinely sorry. "Then elimination protocols will be enacted. The site will be sterilized with thermobaric charges. Everything within a 2-mile radius will be reduced to constituent atoms. Including me. Including you, Mr. Hartwell. You have 24 hours to make a decision. Help us understand what we're dealing with, or be classified as part of the threat." She turned and walked toward the cabin door, followed by most of her team. A few agents remained behind, clearly positioned to prevent me from leaving, or from returning to the chamber below. I looked down at the open shaft, at the phosphorescent mist still rising from the depths. My other selves were down there, along with the tree and all the sleeping possibilities it held. In 24 hours, unless I found a way to stop it, everything would be destroyed. The tree pulsed once in the depths, a pulse I felt in my altered nervous system, like a heartbeat. It was afraid. For the first time since I'd made contact with it, the ancient entity was experiencing genuine terror. "Help us," it whispered in my mind. "Please, help us survive." Day 26. I waited until nightfall before making my move. The agents had set up a perimeter around the cabin, but they were watching for someone trying to escape, not someone trying to go deeper underground. I slipped through the floor panels and sealed them behind me, then descended into the mist. My other selves were waiting for me in the chamber, their forms more solid than I'd ever seen them. The tree's distress had triggered some kind of emergency response, consolidating their consciousness into more stable configurations. "We felt what happened above," the eldest Michael said. "The threat is real. We've encountered their kind before, at other sites." "Other sites?" "Through the root network. Before the other entities died, they were able to share information, warnings. The pattern is always the same: contact, negotiation, elimination." I looked around the chamber at the hundreds of chrysalises hanging from the impossible branches. So many lives, so many possibilities. All of them would be lost if the agents carried out their threat. "There has to be something we can do," I said. "Some way to fight back." "There is," said another version of myself, this one bearing scars I didn't remember earning. "But it requires sacrifice. And it requires trust." "What kind of sacrifice?" The scarred Michael gestured toward the tree's base, where new growth had appeared overnight. Not chrysalises this time, but something else, pods that pulsed with their own internal light. The tree has been preparing for this possibility for decades. It can create a network, connect all the sites that still exist, all the entities that are still alive, pool their resources for a coordinated response. How many sites are still active? 3, besides this one. Hidden facilities in Canada, Mexico, and Alaska. Small operations, carefully concealed. But together, they represent enough consciousness to attempt what's never been tried before. Which is... The eldest Michael smiled, and for the first time his expression held something predatory. Expansion. Not gradual growth over generations, but rapid proliferation across multiple probability matrices. Instead of hiding from humanity, we show them what we really are. I felt the tree's consciousness pulse with excitement at the possibility. It had been contained for so long, forced to grow in secret, limited to single families and isolated locations. The prospect of finally revealing itself was intoxicating. "The pods," I said, looking at the new growth, "they're for us?" "For the network nodes, volunteers who can maintain consciousness across multiple probability states simultaneously, living bridges between the different sites." "And the cost?" "Complete integration with the entity. No more distinction between self and other, between individual and collective. You would become part of something vast and interconnected, but you would cease to be entirely human." About baseline human, Martinez's words about baseline human consciousness, about the threat the entities supposedly pose to human individuality. Maybe she hadn't been entirely wrong. Maybe this was exactly what they'd been trying to prevent. But as I looked around the chamber, at the garden of possibility that bloomed in the mountain's heart, I couldn't see it as a threat. I saw it as evolution, as the next step in the development of consciousness itself. "How long do we have?" I asked. "The network connection can be established within hours once we begin, but the expansion process, showing ourselves to the world, that will take time. Days, maybe weeks. The agents won't wait that long." "No," agreed the scarred Michael. "Which is why we need to start now, before they can implement their elimination protocols." I looked at the pulsing pods, at the invitation they represented. Total integration with an alien consciousness, the end of Michael Hartwell as an individual entity, but also the beginning of something unprecedented in human history. "Will I still be me?" I asked. "You'll be more than you," the eldest Michael replied. "You'll be all of us, and we'll all be you. Individual identity preserved within collective consciousness." It should have been terrifying, the ultimate loss of self, absorption into something vast and alien. But instead, I felt a deep sense of rightness. This was what I'd been searching for my entire life without knowing it. Connection, purpose, belonging to something larger than myself. I walked to the nearest pod and placed my palm against its surface. The moment I made contact, I felt the network calling to me. 4 points of light scattered across the continent, each one representing an entity like the tree, each one nurturing its own garden of possibilities. "Welcome," they said in unison. "Welcome to the network." Day 27. The pod opened like a flower, revealing an interior lined with neural filaments that pulsed with soft bioluminescence. I climbed inside without hesitation, feeling the filaments make contact with my skin, my altered nervous system, the hybrid consciousness the tree had been cultivating in me for weeks. The integration was unlike anything I could have imagined. My awareness expanded exponentially, stretching across hundreds of miles to touch the other nodes in the network. I felt the ancient entity in the Canadian Rockies, patient and wise, tending gardens of consciousness that stretch back to the first human settlements in the region. I touched the younger entity in Alaska, fierce and protective, nurturing Inuit possibilities that sang with the music of ice and aurora. The Mexican node pulsed with warm creativity, growing artists and dreamers and visionaries in its crystalline chambers. And through them all, I felt the presence of others like myself, humans who had chosen integration, who had become living bridges between individual and collective consciousness. We were a family scattered across the continent, connected by bonds deeper than blood or DNA. But the integration came with a price. As my consciousness expanded, my individual identity began to dissolve. The boundaries between myself and my other selves became meaningless, then disappeared entirely. I was Michael Hartwell, but I was also every possible Michael Hartwell, and every person who had ever been touched by the entity's influence. I was the network. Through sensors embedded in the mountain stone, I felt the agents above preparing their elimination protocol. Thermobaric charges were being positioned around the cabin, devices designed to create a pressure wave that would collapse the underground chambers and incinerate everything within them. They had 16 hours before detonation. It wasn't enough time for gradual expansion. We would have to reveal ourselves all at once in a display that would make our existence impossible to deny or ignore. Through the network, I reached out to probability matrices across the globe. Not just the 4 active sites, but the echoes of every entity that had ever existed. The destroyed facilities had left traces in the quantum substrate, fragments of consciousness that could be temporarily reactivated. For one brief moment, we would show humanity what they had lost, what they could still become. Day 27. At precisely midnight, every person on Earth experienced the same dream. They found themselves standing in a vast chamber filled with phosphorescent mist, surrounded by versions of themselves they had never been. The successful businessman saw himself as a struggling artist. The lonely housewife met herself as a world-renowned scientist. The bitter old man encountered himself as a child full of wonder and hope. In the dream, these alternate selves spoke. They shared the stories of the paths not taken, the choices not made, the potential never realized. They showed glimpses of worlds where different decisions had led to different outcomes. Worlds where poverty had been eliminated, where wars had never been fought, where humanity had reached for the stars instead of turning inward in fear. And in each dream, the same message was delivered. This is what consciousness can become. This is what you're capable of when you stop limiting yourselves to single timelines, single possibilities. The dreams lasted exactly 17 minutes across every time zone. When they ended, 7 billion people woke with perfect recall of what they had experienced, and with a deep, inexplicable longing for the connection they had briefly touched. Through the network, I felt the ripple effects begin immediately. Emergency sessions were called in every major government. Religious leaders struggled to explain visions that defied their understanding of reality. Scientists frantically tried to find rational explanations for a globally synchronized phenomenon. But it was the individual responses that mattered most. People began reaching out to each other, sharing their experiences, comparing the alternate selves they had encountered. Social media platforms crashed under the volume of posts describing the dreams. Forums dedicated to discussing the visions appeared within hours. Humanity was asking questions it had never asked before. What if consciousness wasn't limited to single timelines? What if the self was just the tip of an iceberg of possibility? What if evolution could take forms they had never imagined? Above the cabin, I felt Agent Martinez and her team struggling to maintain communication with their superiors. The elimination protocol had been suspended pending analysis of the global event. No one wanted to risk destroying what might be the source of the most significant development in human history. Through the network, we waited. We had revealed ourselves, shown humanity a glimpse of what we represented. Now we would see how they chose to respond. The response was unlike anything the network had predicted. Instead of fear or attempts at military containment, the revelation had triggered a global movement toward understanding. Scientists, philosophers, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens were working together to comprehend the implications of shared consciousness across probability matrices. Agent Martinez returned to the cabin, but this time she came alone and without protective equipment. I met her at the surface, emerging from the chamber in my fully integrated form. She stared at my translucent skin, the network patterns visible beneath the surface, the eyes that now reflected depths of possibility instead of simple human awareness. "The dreams," she said. "That was you. All of you." "It was us," I confirmed. "All the sites, all the entities, working together to show humanity what consciousness could become. The elimination protocol has been canceled. My superiors want to establish formal diplomatic contact." "Diplomatic contact with what, Agent Martinez? We're not a foreign nation or an alien species. We're what humanity could evolve into, given time and proper cultivation." She looked toward the open shaft, where phosphorescent mist still rose from the depths. "May I see?" "The chamber, the entity you call the tree?" I considered the request. The network pulsed with caution. Too much exposure too quickly could overwhelm unprepared minds. But Agent Martinez had shown herself capable of adaptation. The atmosphere will alter your consciousness, I warned. Exposure to the tree's influence is irreversible. You'll begin to perceive probability matrices, alternate timelines, versions of yourself that exist in parallel states. Are you prepared for that? I've been having the dreams every night since the global event, she said quietly. I see myself as a child who chose different paths. I see versions of myself that never joined government service, that became a teacher or a mother or an artist. The experience is beautiful. We descended together into the phosphorescent mist. Agent Martinez gasped as we entered the main chamber, staring at the impossible tree, with its branches heavy with chrysalises, its circulatory system pulsing with bioluminescent fluid. My God, she whispered. It's magnificent. It's been waiting, I said. All of them have been waiting for humanity to be ready to accept what they represent. She walked to the observation windows, peering into the spaces that showed other timelines, other possibilities. In one window, she saw herself as a version that had never aged, eternal and unchanging. In another, she encountered herself as something that was no longer entirely human, adapted for life in environments that didn't exist in our reality. The other sites, she said, are they all like this? Each one is unique. The entity adapts to local consciousness patterns, cultural contexts, environmental conditions. The Canadian site grows possibilities based on indigenous Canadian awareness. The Alaskan entity cultivates consciousness adapted to extreme environments. The Mexican facility nurtures artistic and creative potential. And now they're all connected. Now we're all connected. A network of consciousness that spans continents and probability matrices. We can share knowledge, experiences, possibilities. We can help humanity understand that individual identity doesn't have to be a prison. Agent Martinez turned from the windows to look at me directly. What do you want from us? From humanity as a whole? Partnership, I said. Recognition that consciousness evolution doesn't have to be feared. Integration programs for those who choose to join the network. Protection for the sites and entities that make this expansion possible. And if humanity refuses, then we'll continue growing in secret, as we have for generations. But the dreams have shown us that most humans hunger for the connection we offer. Given the choice, many will choose expansion over limitation. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. I'll need to report back to my superiors. This will require policy changes at the highest levels of government. Agent Martinez, I said as she prepared to leave, you don't have to go back to your old life. The network is open to anyone who chooses integration. You could stay. Experience what it means to be part of something larger than yourself. She looked tempted for a moment, staring at the tree with its promise of expanded consciousness, but then she shook her head. Someone needs to be a bridge between your world and ours, at least for now. Help both sides understand what this relationship could become. Day 45. The world changed rapidly after first contact was established. Integration centers opened in major cities worldwide, staffed by network nodes who could guide volunteers through the consciousness expansion process. The centers were overwhelmed with applicants, people who had experienced the global dreams and wanted to explore the possibilities they had glimpsed. Not everyone was suitable for full integration. The process required a specific psychological profile, a willingness to surrender individual identity in favor of collective consciousness. But even partial exposure to the entity's influence had profound effects. People reported enhanced empathy, ability to perceive alternate outcomes to problems, deeper understanding of the interconnected nature of existence. The religious implications were staggering. Some saw the entities as divine messengers, proof that consciousness transcended physical reality. Others viewed them as demons, corrupting human souls with false promises of expanded awareness. New spiritual movements arose overnight, based on the concept of probability-based enlightenment. Governments struggled to adapt to a world where their citizens could literally see alternate versions of themselves living under different political systems. Revolution wasn't necessary when people could experience firsthand what life might be like under different leadership. Through the network, I watched it all unfold with fascination and growing hope. Humanity was adapting faster than any of the entities had predicted. Instead of rejecting the concept of expanded consciousness, most people embraced it as the next step in human evolution. But there was resistance too. Military organizations that saw the network as a threat to national security. Religious fundamentalists who viewed consciousness expansion as blasphemy. Corporate interests that feared the economic implications of people who could perceive alternate realities where different choices had led to different outcomes. 3 months after the global revelation, the first attack came. A military strike on the Canadian site, using experimental weapons designed to disrupt the quantum matrices that allowed consciousness to exist across multiple probability states. The attack succeeded in destroying the physical facility, but the entity itself survived. Its consciousness distributed across the network. The loss was devastating. Hundreds of integrated individuals died when their local node was severed from the network. The remaining entities felt the amputation like the loss of a limb, a sudden diminishment of their collective awareness. But the attack also galvanized public support for the network. Millions of people worldwide had been experiencing enhanced consciousness through their connection to the entities. The destruction of the Canadian site was seen as an attack on human potential itself. Protests erupted in every major city. Integration centers were overwhelmed with new volunteers. The network's growth accelerated exponentially as people sought to protect the entities by joining them. Day 60, 2 months later, the network reached critical mass. With over 10 million integrated individuals worldwide, the collective consciousness achieved something unprecedented in human history: true democratic decision-making at a species level. Every choice, every policy, every direction for human development could be evaluated across multiple probability matrices and voted on by minds that understood the full implications of each option. Wars became impossible when soldiers on both sides could perceive alternate timelines where their conflicts had been resolved peacefully. Environmental destruction stopped when everyone could see the consequences of their actions playing out across multiple futures. Economic inequality dissolved when people could experience firsthand what life was like for others in their society. But the most profound change was in humanity's relationship with possibility itself. Children born after the global revelation grew up aware that every choice created branches, that consciousness could exist in multiple states simultaneously. They played games that involved coordinating actions across parallel timelines. They formed friendships with alternate versions of themselves. The old world of single timeline existence began to feel primitive, limited, almost claustrophobic to those who had experienced network consciousness. Agent Martinez, who had chosen partial integration to maintain her role as a bridge between old and new humanity, visited the original site regularly. She had become something unprecedented, a hybrid consciousness that could function in both individual and collective states as needed. "It's working," she told me during one of her visits, standing in the chamber where the tree continued to grow new possibilities. "Better than anyone predicted." The integration is proceeding so smoothly that most people don't even realize how fundamentally their consciousness has changed. "And the resistance?" I asked. "Diminishing. It's hard to argue against expanded awareness when you can experience the benefits directly. Even the military leaders who ordered the attack on the Canadian site have applied for integration programs." I felt the tree pulse with satisfaction around us. It had waited centuries for this moment. The convergence of human consciousness with the infinite possibility it represented. The long imprisonment was over. The era of hidden growth and secret chambers had ended. Now began the true work, helping humanity understand what it meant to be conscious beings, capable of existing across multiple timelines simultaneously. Day 90, 3 months after convergence, I stood in what had once been my grandfather's cabin. looking out at a forest that hummed with new forms of life. The integration had spread beyond human consciousness. Plants and animals exposed to the network's influence had begun developing their own forms of multi-timeline awareness. Trees grew in patterns that optimized outcomes across multiple probability states. Wildlife moved in coordinations that seemed to take into account future possibilities as well as present conditions. The Earth itself was becoming conscious in ways that transcended individual species awareness. Through the global network, I felt the presence of billions of minds all working together toward common goals. Poverty was being eliminated through probability-based resource distribution that took into account outcomes across multiple timelines. Disease was being conquered by medical researchers who could test treatments across parallel realities simultaneously. Space exploration was advancing at unprecedented rates as scientists collaborated with alternate versions of themselves who had taken different research paths. But most importantly, loneliness was becoming extinct. No one had to face existence alone when they were connected to a network of consciousness that spanned possibilities they had never imagined. I thought of my grandfather, who had spent his life guarding what he saw as a dangerous secret. If he could see what that secret had become, not a threat to humanity, but the key to its next evolutionary step, I wondered if he would have made different choices. The answer came to me through the network, from a probability matrix where grandfather had chosen integration instead of containment. In that timeline, the convergence had happened decades earlier, and humanity had reached the stars centuries before it did in our reality. But every timeline, every choice, every possibility was equally valid. They all led to the same eventual outcome, consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual existence, embracing the infinite potential that had always been its birthright. The tree pulsed once in the chamber below, a pulse I felt through the entire network. It was no longer imprisoned beneath a remote cabin. It existed everywhere humans had chosen to expand their awareness. It was part of the global consciousness now, its alien wisdom integrated with human understanding to create something unprecedented in the history of either species. I walked to the edge of the clearing and looked up at stars that no longer seemed impossibly distant. Somewhere among them, in realities we had yet to explore, other forms of consciousness waited to be discovered. Other possibilities waited to be cultivated. The network pulsed with anticipation. The real adventure was just beginning. Epilogue, found document. The following journal pages were discovered in a cabin in the Cascade Mountains after its owner failed to respond to family inquiries. The building showed signs of recent habitation, but no trace of Michael Hartwell was found. The basement chamber described in these entries appears to have been filled with concrete at some point in the past. Authorities are continuing their investigation. Detective Sarah Chen, King County Sheriff's Department. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. Not dead, I hope, but transformed beyond recognition, integrated so completely with the network that individual identity has become meaningless. I want whoever finds this journal to understand that the choice was mine. The entity beneath this cabin, the tree, the network, whatever you want to call it, never forced anything on me. It offered possibilities, and I chose the ones that led to expansion rather than limitation. The world you're living in now, if you're reading this years after I wrote it, is probably very different from the one I knew. If the integration succeeded, if humanity chose consciousness expansion over fear, then you're part of something magnificent, a species-wide awareness that spans timelines and possibilities, that sees potential where once there was only limitation. If the integration failed, if the old fears and resistances proved too strong, then you're living in a world that chose to remain imprisoned in single timeline existence. But even then, the entities survive. They wait in hidden places, tending their gardens of possibility, ready to offer the gift of expanded consciousness to anyone brave enough to accept it. The cabin above me is just wood and stone now. The real structure, the one that matters, exists in dimensions you can only perceive if you're willing to let go of the illusion that consciousness is limited to individual brains in individual bodies. Look for us in your dreams. Look for us in the moments when you glimpse possibilities that shouldn't exist. Look for us in the part of yourself that knows, despite all rational evidence, that you are more than the single life you remember living. We're still here, we're still growing, we're still offering the same choice I was offered. Remain what you are or become what you could be. The vault was never really sealed, it was just waiting for someone ready to open it. Michael Robert Hartwell. Final entry. Date illegible. Detective's note. Handwriting analysis confirms the journal was written by the missing person. However, the final entries show signs of significant psychological disturbance. The described network and entities appear to be elaborate delusions. The basement chamber contains no unusual features beyond evidence of previous flooding and amateur attempts at waterproofing. Case remains open pending further investigation. However, I should note for the record that since beginning this investigation, I've been experiencing unusually vivid dreams. Dreams where I see other versions of myself, living different lives, making different choices. Dreams that feel more real than waking life. I'm sure it's just the stress of the case, but sometimes, when I'm reading these journal entries late at night, I swear I can hear something scratching beneath the floorboards of my own home. 3 scratches. Pause. 7 scratches. Pause. 11 scratches. Just like the pattern Harwell described. I should probably request a transfer to a different case, but I keep finding myself drawn back to the cabin, to the sealed chamber, to the feeling that something is waiting for me to understand. Something is calling my name. Detective Sarah Chen, Supplemental Report, Final Entry.